Remind yourself again, about the stability issues associated with making certain that we don't disturb our neighbors and we pay attention. Attend. Today we have Professor Don Romesburg, one of our own dear colleagues who's been the FYE program has been lucky enough to have Professor Romesburg speak to us even before he became a professor in our program. He has his PhD from Berkeley. He is professor in our Women's and Gender Studies department and a highly esteemed and sought-after speaker and teacher. His MA is from Colorado. Are you from Colorado originally?
I'm from Juneau, Alaska.
Are you serious?
Shout out, anyone? No.
So he studied history for bachelor's and master's degree. Is that right? History.
Yep.
He studies many aspects of gender, queer studies and culture, feminist theory, theories of men and masculinity. He is currently statewide here in the state of California, a leader in the charge to include the history and contributions of LGBTQ people in public schools. So we've been looking really hard at issues of identity, in many facets and manifestations. Now we're into this book, The 3 Pointers Like Oscar Wilde, where all kinds of issues of identity are raised, especially many issues of masculinity and identity. So that's what Professor Romesburg is going to talk to us about today. Gender, sexuality, and identity. Professor Romesburg.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about a few things here today. I'm going to give you a particular kind of argument about how to interpret the brief, wondrous life of Oscar Wilde through the lens of masculinity studies. To do that, I'm also going to talk about masculinity in general, and specifically the way in which masculinity plays out. Gosh, that's so loud. Doesn't sound that loud to you? Okay, it does to me.
And I love my voice. Especially how it plays out in relationship to college and college role identities and navigation. So to do that, I need to kind of start by backing up and talking a little bit about what women's and gender studies is and what feminism is and how a feminist practice to understanding masculinity can help us here. So I want to start, though, just by looking at these 3 different images of masculinity. Right? We've got a college dorm room, an unfortunate situation, and Trujillo there. I wore my shirt that has the little epaulette things on it because I thought that would be my gesture to his dictatorship. So when you look at these, what comes out? What stands out for you about masculinity in these? What is something that you notice about any one of these things that speaks to you in terms of masculinity? I mean, clearly you're noticing the one in the middle, right? So what's happening in that picture? What? Shout it out. Okay, he fell asleep and his friends drew on him, right? But they could have drawn something like, women are powerful or stop racism, right? But they didn't, right? They drew something else. So why did they draw what they drew on him? To embarrass him. And what's embarrassing about it? It says penis on it, right? Penis. It says whore on the side over here. I believe this is a badly drawn version of a penis going into his mouth over here, right? So, what's the joke? That he's gay, right? That's it, right? Okay, so that's the joke that's put forth here, right? How hilarious that, a penis-having person would want a penis in his mouth, right? That is funny and humiliating, right? And there's a layer of extra humiliation here because if you're a guy, you're supposed to be able to hold your liquor, you're supposed to be able to party, and if you're drinking in college and you get too drunk and you pass out, then it's understood that one of the punishments for that, if you're a man, if you're a guy, right, is that you are humiliated by your friends, and the best way to do that is to mark you in some way as a faggot. Right, that's the joke, right? Okay, so what feminism allows us to do is to take these very mundane and ordinary things about joking and masculinity and drinking and college and what it means to be a man, right? And what it means to be in a band of brothers and like with your friends, right? It takes those things and it stops and it makes us think a little bit about what are the power relationships that are behind this? What compels certain things forward as sort of the easiest path forward? And then why is it so broadly socially acceptable for us to do these things, right? To the point where it seems perfectly ordinary, okay? Or even harmless, right? So, so let's go forward a little bit with this. So what is women and gender studies? Well, I leave a link here at the top. This is the screen. The slides are up on your the FYE mega site, but meta site, mega site, whatever. I made it into a Walmart. But you can learn more about the Women's and Gender Studies department and the major, the minor. We have lots of great classes. If anything that I talked about today seems interesting or provocative to you in some way, I encourage you to think about taking one of our lower division classes. Like next semester, we're offering 2 sections of women's bodies, health, and image, which is in area E, lower division GE. Also, if some of this is interesting to you, I'm running the Queer Studies lecture series next fall, or next spring rather. We'll have 12 amazing speakers, scholars, activists, artists coming, and basically you come like you do here. You see 12 of them throughout the semester. You write 2 very short papers and you get a unit for it. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and check out the website there. So this I thought was great because Tatsuya Ishida is a comic artist who created a way to think about what feminism does in terms of when we understand it, what it does for the world. And it's playing with the idea of the matrix here, right? So, so Women's and Gender Studies proposes that everything from our most innermost sort of thoughts about ourselves to the broadest systems and structures of society are formed and structured through gendered power relationships. And that those power relationships intersect with power relationships around race, class, ability, sexuality, nation, and so on, right? And that you can't actually understand social reality and the way social reality operates unless you can look through an interdisciplinary lens like the lens of feminism to understand how social power undergirds and sort of is sown throughout all of that. So here's our young woman, right, girl, who is, suddenly realizing, right, as in the Matrix, right, she clearly has taken the red pill, right, and she's starting to see how it operates. And as she does, she starts to say, hey, wait a second, there's something about gender and the way it works in society that's doing something to me and to people around me. So what is that, right? And so Women's and Gender Studies helps you to recognize and then analyze how gendered power operates, what it is and how it operates, right? So we have this term patriarchy, which is kind of a male-centered, male-dominated social structure that operates in all sorts of ways. And here we have, right, she's like, oh, this is the social interactive construct that bombards us with misogyny, right? Sort of either active sort of hatred or antipathy toward women or hostility toward them, or just the objectification or downplaying of their value or worth, right? So she goes through and sort of realizes, right, that this permeates all aspects of society, and then you have all these different examples of it, right, as it's playing out. And what I like is, right, this one's clearly like men putting women down, boys putting girls down, right? Patriarch, incubator, minions, right? Like the family structure itself as being male-centered or dominated. But then it moves away from this idea of men's power over women to the idea that everyone is disciplined through its systems, through the systems of patriarchy, right? It keeps both men and women locked into rigid gender roles. And so that's one of the really important things that feminism and that women's and gender studies does for it. Because what this does, right, when we're locked in these gender roles, is it makes us feel alienated from one another, disconnected from one another, because we're not relating to each other directly, we're relating to each other through these roles, right? And that's a loss for everyone. So what can we do to make more lives livable, to work with this problem? One of the great things about women and gender studies is that as a field, we don't claim objectivity. We don't claim that we are some distant, removed thing. We're doing the knowledge production we're doing the work that we're doing because we want to make more lives livable. We are oriented towards social justice. That's why we do what we do, okay? And so, right, she suddenly is like, well, what do I do? Am I a colluder in this system now that I know about it, right? And it's not the Neo, whatever the character is, the Lawrence Fishburne character, right, is this little girl on the tricycle. Right? She says, everyone's a colluder in the system, but now you see it, you can do something about it, right? So what I'm hoping to do here is that you'll take the red pill with me, you'll start to see this system, and once you do, I'm going to give you some suggestions about what to do about it. Okay, so this is Masculinity Studies 101. Masculinity Studies as a field has been around for about 30 years. And it goes beyond just looking at women and gender studies as being about the concerns of women and women's oppression by men, and more specifically looks at how men operate in society through a gendered lens, right? And so that's what we're going to be looking at here today. So first of all, number one, we don't have a gender, we do gender. What does this mean? It means that there are scripted roles that we step into. The stage is already set. The characters are already there before we arrive on the scene, right? And so there are intentional ways that we act into those gender roles. But there are also ways in which they exceed our intent. We don't have control over them. So the way that these happen then, the way that we do gender as a process, and this comes from somebody, Connell is his name, who's sort of one of the early sort of grandfathers of masculinity studies. He argues, as does Judith Butler, that we perform these ceaseless acts over and over again to look as if these roles are stable and actually are who we are. So we perform them over and over again to ourselves, to others, to the broader society, right? And the way that we are recognized by others in our gender roles successfully is by how closely approximate we are to the thing that we're trying to be, right? So if you think about some trans people, transgender people, for example, some can be stealth, meaning that you don't even think of them as trans because they fully pass. They approximate the social roles of gender that we expect out of a male if they're a female-to-male trans guy, for example, right? And then others don't. They can't go stealth, right? And this is a problem for a lot of trans women in particular, where they can't, they won't necessarily be easily read as a cisgender or birth-assigned female biological woman, right? And so they go through the world with this kind of incongruity. And it's that incongruity between social role and the identity that you're trying to be that can often lead to the devaluing of you, to violence against you, to your subordination, right? So what that tells us then is that, actually, I'll go to the next one after this. So another thing I want to say, though, about masculinity is that if you understand that masculinity is social roles and that these roles are socially constructed, right, not just emerging out of our hormones in some universal natural way, that all men are like X and all women are like Y, right, then you have to understand that masculinity is culturally contingent. What does that mean? It means that masculinity, the norms of masculinity have been different in different times and places, that different cultures and subcultures have their own norms and expectations of what a proper masculinity is, or successful masculinity is. That it means that there are certain kinds of masculinity that get more privileged in certain contexts and others that become more subordinated, right? Put under those other ones. And it means that there are multiple forms of masculinity at play, right? And so we can look at, for example, in Oscar Wilde, right? We have all sorts of different forms of masculinity, but the main conversation that he's having about masculinity, Diaz is having, is about this conversation with diasporic 20th and 21st century, but really 20th century Dominican masculinities, right? That's kind of the world that we're inhabiting here. But another kind of masculinity that we're going to be thinking about today is contemporary US, often white-dominated college masculinities. So the one that most of you as men inhabit in some form or another. And because there are certain kinds of masculinities in the range of multiple masculinities that are more dominant over others, what we would call hegemonic, those that sort of situate themselves as if they are the norm for the whole of society. All other kinds of masculinity need to pass through or address in some way that dominant form of masculinity. And so this is the next part I want to talk about. So masculinity then is not something you have, it's something you do. You do it more or less successfully. It relies on the recognition of others and of institutions and of all sorts of things to be validated or to be invalidated, right? So it's disciplinary. And this is the fuku, right? The curse of masculinity, of hegemonic masculinity, of normative masculinity. The Diaz is of course talking about the fuku of colonialism and the way it plays out in Dominican masculinities and in diasporic Dominican masculinities, right? But I would argue that there's a fuku about normative masculinity itself. There's a curse that we are all sort of trying to find our zafa, right? Our counterspell that we can cast in relationship to it, okay? And I'll get to the zafas at the end of the talk. So the thing about normative masculinity is it's an ideal. It's not actually something that is natural and real in the sense that it's universal and true, right? It's socially constructed, but it's an ideal that gets positioned as if it's normal and natural. So we are beholden to it in that sense, right? But nobody can fully possess it, right? If you don't have a gender, if you do gender, then that means that you are doing it over and over and over again. And what that means is that in terms of masculinity and normative masculinity, all of us end up being structured or in the ways in which we're able to be more approximate to it, or the ways in which we fail to sort of resemble our proximity to it. And I'll give you a specific example of this. So when I was in high school, I was sort of coming into the awareness that I was gay. I hadn't really fully articulated that yet, but I was like kind of circling around it, right? And I was also more to the point aware that someone might think I was gay. Whether or not I happened to ever figure out whether I was gay or not, I was concerned that people would think I was gay. And so I sort of watched people that I thought of as really normatively masculine, sort of like the stoner jocks were kind of the ones, the exemplars of like, right, perfect masculinity in my school, right? So the stoner jocks were like, you know, they would walk around with like a certain kind of sort of demeanor, right? And so like I really watched, and like, so they would put their shoulders back, right? And they would put their hips forward, right? Their hips would sort of go forward a little bit, right? And they would just kind of walk like this, right? Like, hey, what's up? Right? What's up? Hey. Right? And so I was like, oh, that's how I'm going to walk, right? And so I got it all, like I figured it out, and like, you know, and I was pretty like good with it, right? And I tried to lower my voice a little, and I have a tiny lisp, and I tried to make sure that wasn't around anymore, right? Hey, everybody, what's up, right? Hey. And so like I was able to approximate in some ways, right, this ideal, but I was never able to keep it. Like, it wasn't like once I was like, okay, now that I'm like this, like it's set, I'm all secure, right? Because at any moment, I could not be again, right? It's a ceaseless performative act, right? So we all must navigate the demands of normative masculinity, whether we want to approximate it or not. And what's interesting and what a lot of sociologists have talked about is that these multiple kinds of masculinities, masculinities of men of color, of gay men, nerds, right? Jocks, scholars, all these different kinds of goth kids, right? Emos, all these different kinds of masculinity relate to one another through their relationship to this normative sense of masculinity, right? This idea that it's straight, that it's certain of itself, that it's self-confident, that it's powerful, that it's all-knowing, that one has command, that one's mind sort of commands one's body, that one is, has sexual prowess, right? That one is athletic, right? All these different things that make up normative masculinity. One is successful, right? Financially, and so on. So, okay. And so those are sort of the basics, right, that you need to know about how masculinity operates, at least in the field of masculinity studies, right? We do gender. Masculinity isn't one thing everywhere always. It's culturally contingent. And it's disciplinary, right? And it's the disciplinary aspect of it that ends up being the foucoup. And we'll explore what that means. So this leads to what Michael Kimmel, who's another sort of grandfather of the masculinity studies field, calls the masculine paradox, okay? The masculine paradox is that on the one hand, because of male privilege, men as a group are powerful. Now, some of you might be saying, I don't know if male privilege really exists. Men and women are, you know, different but the same. The whole idea of like sexism is an antiquated thing. And whenever students kind of bring that up as a concern or as a doubt, right, they're dubious that there is such a thing as male privilege anymore anyway, right? There are all these laws that protect us against gender discrimination and so on down the row. I always just do a quick exercise, okay? So among the men here, how many of you feel more or less safe walking in the parking lots on this campus by yourself at night? How many men feel more or less safe walking in the parking lots at night? Okay. Let me ask that a different way. How many of you, because I see you four not participating, so I want to see if you'll answer it this way. Because one form of masculine privilege is to not participate, is to, right, put down your baseball cap and I'm just going to hang back here, right? So let's try it a different way. How many of you men feel unsafe walking alone at night in the parking lots on campus? Raise your hand. Okay, look around. Hold your hands up. Don't be ashamed if you feel unsafe. That's okay too. A couple of you feel unsafe. Okay, women. How many of you feel unsafe in a parking lot at night on campus? That's male privilege. That's male privilege. Okay? Like, think about that. Gendered power is operative, right? Okay, so men as a group are bestowed this kind of power. We get to feel powerful. We can wear earphones and walk at night, right? Like, there's all sorts of, we can get drunk and not be afraid that that's going to mean, right, that we're going to be acquaintance raped, right? Like, there's so many things that we can generally count on, right? So we're powerful, but the paradox is because normative masculinity has these unattainable aspirations that none of us can ever fully possess, as individuals, we sometimes feel powerless about it. We feel powerless. That pisses us off because the promise of male privilege, the promise of patriarchy, is that we're supposed to have this power all the time. But we don't, right? That sucks, right? We get relegated to the friend zone when we, right, want to just Netflix and chill, right? Look, I just used kids' terms. Okay, I use whippersnappers today. Okay, right. So, I mean, right, there's so many different ways that we feel betrayed by this paradox, right? Yeah, there's a great old, now I'll say something old. There's a great Eminem line that is, I wish I was a little bit taller, I wish I was a baller, I wish I had a girl I could call, I would call her, right? Like that's great, like that's such the masculine paradox right there, right? I should feel powerful, but I don't, right? Okay, so how do we come into this way of being in the world and what do we do with it? There are different ways that we are socialized as men. And your time in particular, the time of college, the time of late adolescence, late high school and into college, is this time that psychologists like Jeffrey Arnett have called emerging adulthood or the transition to adulthood. It's a time where your masculinity is sort of precarious. You don't have like full-time jobs yet. You may not have stable and secure relationships yet. You're not fully, you're not fully sort of confident in who you are in the world yet, right? Here's a hint, you never will be, but you think you will be soon, right? So you're imagining that and you're emerging into who you are as a self, right? And so this is a time when being able to realize your masculinity becomes like acutely important to you, being able to actualize it in some way or another. So masculine socialization teaches boys and young men how to be men in a couple of ways. I just want to show you something here real quick. Hopefully this will work.
Yale University. 5 presidents have gone there. Actors, scholars, leaders. Its global reputation speaks for itself, which makes this fraternity pledge ritual on the campus all the more shocking.
No means yes. Yes means
Okay, it's saying no means yes, yes means anal.
No means yes. And you can look online if you want to know the bleeped word because
Or you
I'm
can
not
just hear it
saying
from me. Okay, so what would compel a bunch of guys in college to go across a dark college campus, Yale no less, right, and yell no means yes, yes means anal? Why would they do that? Yeah. Okay, right? It's definitely a way of like taking up space, taking up power. Like it's like speaking against the authority or autonomy of women, right? But why is it something that guys would do collectively? Okay, so they're like subordinating themselves to some larger social role or social order. And by subordinating themselves to some kind of masculine authority, that masculine authority gets conferred upon them. Whereas if they resisted or refused it, right, they'd be a pussy, right? Nobody wants to be a pussy, right? So they do it. So masculine socialization teaches boys and young men to internalize an imperative to succeed at doing gender in alignment with normative masculinity, right? And here's Junior talking about Oscar at the beginning of the novel, right? When he's like 7 years old. Look at that little macho. His mother's friend said, "Que hombre," right? He's a little man. He's such a man. What a man, right? So at a very young age, whether it's in sort of white dominant American society or whether it's in diasporic Dominican society, this is an example of this. The second thing that it does is it encourages us to engage in disciplinary actions against ourselves and others in order to police the centrality of normative gender. So in other words, we engage in acts, self-disciplinary acts, to show our allegiance to normative gender, and we police other guys for their allegiance to normative gender, and we police women to see whether or not they are acquiescing to the demands of normative gender, right? That's something that we do, right? And so here's an example of that, right? Junior in the section where he's like trying to improve Oscar, right? I should have checked myself into booty rehab, But if you thought I was going to do that, you don't know Dominican men, right? He's conferring sort of his allegiance, his solidarity back with that. Instead of focusing on my own shit, I focused on something easy and redemptive. What's the easy and redemptive thing that he does? What? He makes Oscar work out, right? So he's not finding ways for Oscar in his kind of being to fit into a larger, he's not expanding the possibility of the world so that Oscar can fit. He's trying to shrink Oscar down to fit into the dominant roles of masculinity, right? And he gets pissed off when Oscar doesn't do it, right? Oscar's like, I'm not going to jog anymore. Okay, so one of the key sort of ways that this discipline works is by subordinating masculinities that are not expressing their allegiance successfully to normative masculinity. This is a drawing someone did online of Oscar. I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, so subordinated masculinities get marked by their failure to approximate dominant masculinity. And I'll give you an example of this, right? So this is from around the time the book came out.
You will catch a disease. I said, gay man, don't touch me, please, because you have got a disease. Gay man, put that sperm off your chin. I said, gay man, what you do is a sin. I said, gay man, I won't let you in because you have got a disease. Why are you gay? I saw you sucking some D-I-C-K.
All right, so we can go on with that, but we won't. Right, and so there's a way in which, right, what was happening was a Red Sox fan, I believe it was actually sitting in the Yankee section. And a grand tradition in the New York Yankees baseball fandom is to call Red Sox fans that are sitting in their stands gay, right? And right, and it's like focused on disease, and it's focused on dick sucking, right? So it's got all these kinds of ways that they're sort of positioning themselves as the superordinate and trying to mark as subordinate this other guy, right? And he's trying to take it like in good humor. He's trying to like show that it's not affecting him. And if you watch it, like as it goes on, like his smile becomes more and more forced, and it's like, you know, it's like a really shitty thing, right? So failure gets fixed upon those that are unable to avoid rather, the associations with subordination. Oscar is one of these people, right? But here's another example, right, in real time of this. There's a website called No Homophobes that shows in real time on Twitter how often, why is this so big? That shows how often these words are used on Twitter, right? And so here we have, I don't know why it's not like clocking through, but generally it shows you like this many times. Oh, there we go, right? And it's going, and you can actually see like how often these like subordinating words are used, and you can see it in real time down here, right? It just kind of will scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll. The internet's being a little slow right now for some reason, but generally they scroll and scroll and scroll, right? So this is a great example of sort of the way in which like this hurtful language, this kind of subordinating language is sort of sewn into our daily landscape. I went on to the all-time markers of this, and I thought one thing that was a little bit encouraging is you notice that the use of the word faggot kind of spikes in 2013 and then has another little spike in 2014 and then goes way, way down after that, right? No homo sort of goes up and down, but and that's so gay is kind of falling out of favor. So that was nice to see. But that's called the fag discourse. A sociologist named C.J. Pascoe talks about the fag discourse as something in high school and college that's used by guys to position, right? If you like sushi, you're a fag. If you don't like shop class, you're a fag. If you don't throw the ball right, you're a fag, right? Like the fag is just kind of the generalized discourse to position those who are going to be fixed as subordinated. And in fact, the fag discourse works like a hot potato, right? So you're a fag, so it gets thrown to me, right? And the only way for me to get rid of it so it's not fixed on me as association is to use a joke or humor, right? To not feel like it's actually hurting me, right? But take a joke or humor and throw it at somebody else. And then what do they have to do with it? They have to throw it to somebody else who has to throw it to somebody else. Like that's how the fag discourse works. But for some of us, right, it gets stuck to us. And Oscar is one of those people. And here's an example of how it works, right? You're not a Dominican, meaning a Dominican man. Unhappily, I am. I'm stuck in this role, right? Even though I don't fit it, he says, Oscar says, right? And then Junior says, he looked like that fat homo Oscar Wilde. And I told him so. Melvin said, Oscar Wilde, ¿quién es Oscar Wilde? And that was it. All of us started calling him that. And the tragedy, after a couple of weeks, dude started answering to it. Right? Did you know that's why that's his name in the book, Oscar Wilde? Right? Because of this like homophobic fag discourse thing that's thrown on him. And it's thrown on him because Junior starts getting mad at him because he's not subordinating to Junior's makeover of him that he wants so badly for him to do. Right? He is failing in his domination over Oscar, and he's failing in his allegiance to normative forms of Dominican masculinity. And so what comes out? The fag discourse. Okay, so how do you restore yourself in relationship to this stuff when it happens, right? Here we have Superman, Clark Kent, right? And he's being called a pussy and everything, right? And then Superman, or someone like Superman, right, sort of busts out, right? How do you like them apples, dillweeds? And he's gonna, right, beat the shit out of him with his big, strong muscles and all that, right? So how do you jockey for your proximity to normative masculinity if you are sort of threatened? The first way is to the restoration of your honor through violence, right? And that can be sort of the ritualistic play of first-person shooter games that make you feel like more of a man, right? All the way up to something like Trujillo's dictatorship, right? This sort of cleansing of oneself of anything that isn't masculine through this ritualistic act of either symbolic or real violence. The second, and I just want to mention this briefly, it doesn't have a big role in the book, but in college, there have been really interesting studies, social psychology studies from the last like 10 years or so, a few of them, that have shown that in terms of binge drinking and college masculinity, that the guys who are drinking, among their cohort, who are drinking the most heavily in like fraternities or whatever, often don't perceive themselves to be drinking more heavily than everyone else they're drinking with. So what they think they're doing is keeping up with what everyone else is doing, right? Because that's part of what makes you a man, right? Go hard or go home, right? But actually, they're binge drinking at these much higher rates. It's like this like anxious sort of behavior that they're engaging in, right? So anyway, just reflect on that one. Right? Powerful, powerless. I've talked about the fag discourse. Here's another example of it. And then I want to also mention the way in which sex is a restorative, right? So being able to get some ass, being able to, right, go out and pursue women and being able to score, right? That's a key sort of way to restore one's masculinity if threatened. Right? And because our masculinity is always in peril, right, sort of engaging in this activity is a key part of it, right? And so I thought this was really interesting, right? If the procurement of ass had been any more central to Trujillito, then the regime would have been the world's first kulocracy, right? And maybe, in fact, it was, right? Sort of assocracy, right? And ass meaning women's ass, which means getting some ass, which means women are objectified objects for men to stick their penises into to restore their masculinity. That's what that means, right? Okay, so So just to show you that that's not like some far off distant thing, and I remember this connection being really slow, so hopefully it'll work. Yeah, just at the beginning of this semester, there were a whole series of, There were a whole series of fraternities around the country that were putting up signs like this, right? Rowdy and fun, hope your baby girl is ready for a good time. Freshman daughter drop off, go ahead and drop off mom too. Okay, that's not speaking to the girls. That's speaking to fathers, right, presumably, the presumed keepers of the women, to pass their women to these other men, who then they will be the objects of possessions of those men, right? That's what that's saying when you break it down, right? But it's funny to a certain audience, right? Because it shows this kind of allegiance to this quote-unquote lighthearted allegiance to this sort of normative masculine mandate, or this restorative mandate to objectify women. Okay, I'm coming near the end of my time, so I want to suggest, I think I've done a pretty good job actually of not of showcasing to you that I was concerned that you were going to walk away from this talk thinking that Dominican masculinity bad, other kinds of masculinity good. But I don't think I've spent so much time on Dominican forms of masculinity that I think you can understand that sort of white dominant male, young male, heterosexual college campus masculinity has these same sort of burdens attached to it, right? They manifest in maybe slightly different ways, but I just want to sort of underscore that one of the key mechanisms through which these sort of toxic relationships to normative masculinity persist is through bros before hoes, this kind of notion of male-to-male homosocial solidarity against those things that would threaten normative masculinity. And what I would argue in very sort of bros before hoes terms is that you need to be very careful, guys, that you're not being normative masculinity's bitch. Because you think that you're being, right, by playing into these codes, the guy code, right, all these things, you think you're playing into your own strength, your own masculinity, right? But maybe, just maybe, you're subordinating yourself to a whole toxic system that isn't necessarily doing you or others very well. I give some examples of that. Okay, so Zathas, right? What are the counter spells we can cast? What are some of the ways we can change this, right? If we agree that this isn't what we want. One thing I want to show you is that there's the Hub has these series of talks, and there's a couple still coming up on the 16th and the 7th, where you can go to the Hub and you can talk about sort of the different ways in which the relationships of power and identity and masculinity play out. You can come if you're a guy, and you can come if you're not a guy, but it's specifically intended for guys to kind of have this dialogue, something we don't often do. One of the Zathas you can engage in is to refuse the first rule of Fight Club when it comes to normative masculinity. So what's the first rule of Fight Club? I can't believe you all still know that. What's the second rule of Fight Club? Don't talk about Fight Club, right? So talk about masculinity. Talk about masculinity in terms of gendered power. Talk about the way that your relationship to normative forms of masculinity and to disciplinary forms of masculinity, right? Where do you fit into it? Where do you fit into it in your relationships with your peers, in your relationships with women, in your relationships with other guys with other kinds of masculinity, right? Second, value a kind of democratic manhood that values many different types of manhood over the totalitarian gender work of normative masculinity, right? And that comes from De Moya, who writes on Latin American masculinities, this idea of totalitarian gender work. Nurture resiliency and empathy with one another. So understand that we are not here to secure or jockey or front ourselves as forward or more dominant to others, right? But to nurture others' resiliency, and that we don't need to be strong and silent, right? But that we need to look for the ways to be empathic towards others. Cultivate friendships collectively, not bands of brothers, bros before hoes. Develop dialogues about masculinity. Of course, Women's and Gender Studies is great for this, but the hub, that's where that links to, does this stuff too. As guys, and I'm talking just to the guys here, but certainly women, you can be involved with this too, and you are a central part of this process. And believe me, as a Women's and Gender Studies professor, I value your voice, perspective, and action, right? Know that. But guys, you can make collective and invested efforts to challenge and confront the more toxic ways that masculinity plays out in our culture, in our society, in our interpersonal relationships, and in ourselves. When people act in ways that are clearly toxic and hurtful or subordinating, talk about it. Call it out. Use it as a teachable moment to create a dialogue. And then finally, I want to emphasize that we can celebrate men and being men. Men themselves are not the problem. Normative masculinity as a disciplinary force in our lives is the problem, right? So this isn't about men are pigs and, right, women are awesome, right? Or men are dogs or men are whatever. Know that this is about reflection, celebration of all of our differences, but being sort of critically aware of the way that gendered power operates. And then just to end, I wanted to give a couple of seminar questions here. How is Diaz's novel Azafa Against Masculinity's Foucaults? And how is that novel complicit in some of those Foucaults? How is it that it actually plays into objectification of women and subordination of other men and multiple masculinities and all those kinds of things? Okay, stop. We have 2 minutes. I'll take one question. Yes, women can be considered masculine. Because we do gender and don't have gender, right? There are masculine women and feminine men. And there's a theorist named Judith Halberstam who wrote a whole book called Female Masculinity in 1999 that talks about one of the ways that women betray this promise that normative masculinity is normal and natural for men is by being able to exemplify it and actualize it in who they are as people, right? By showing that, they show that it is a social construction and not something universal to male-bodied persons. I can take one more question. Well, the radical feminists don't say that. But if you want to know about radical feminism, take Feminist Theory, WGS 475, and you can learn all about it. But what I would say to that is that it is easy to try, because normative forms of masculinity can be so toxic, and because they are so clearly harmful to women, and sometimes in less obvious ways harmful to men, I think it can be tempting to say that men are the problem. And I think that in those moments, what's important to say is not, hey, not all guys are that way, but to say to these radical feminists, right? Say to them, hey, are we talking about men here, or are we talking about like the way that social roles of masculinity hurt people? Because if that's what we're talking about, I think we have a real dialogue to begin. Okay? Thanks a lot, everybody.